listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are live from America and just outside the Matrix. And it's time once again for the show that brings you the truth behind the headlines. I'm investigative journalist Lee Stranahan, and this is The Backstory. We made it through a week, and it's a historic week. I got to say that. It's a historic week. It's a very interesting time to be doing the news. And once again, I want to say to everyone at Sputnik, including our intrepid producer, Rod, our multifaceted engineer, Saul, and my boss over here, Mindia, at Sputnik. It's so great to be working here, working with you guys. Thanks so much for your work on the show. And thanks for helping me have the opportunity to tell the damn truth. The truth I've been telling as a journalist for 13 years. But I sometimes, I've told the story before. When I wanted to go to Lebanon, I'd bought the ticket. I'd raised the money independently. When I was working for Breitbart, Steve Bannon tried to stop me from going to Lebanon, from reporting the truth. I didn't even know what the truth was then. I just knew I had to go over there to try to figure it out. And I got stopped and shut down at Breitbart. Over and over again, I've been shut down in my journalistic career. It's never happened here at Sputnik. And thanks so much to everybody who works here, management here, and everyone ever listening. I really appreciate it. We got a great show for you today. It's Frosty Friday. Our friend Mark Frost. You there, Mark?
I am.
Mark, I'm gonna let you do the boom in a second here, but then I'm gonna give you credit. I want to give you props for something you were right on. Then, for equal time purposes, I'll give myself props, but I'll do that after the boom. Let me tell you about the show today. We have Wyatt Reed, the producer correspondent. He is really for Sputnik now. I think that's his title officially. Is that right, Rod? He's a correspondent, correct?
I believe he's also produces for the internet. I'm sorry. No, Saul said it last time. I forgot. But he has a different title now.
Well, Saul, what's his title?
Correspondent and media producer.
Correspondent media producer. That's pretty good. That sounds like he sounds too good for us, Saul. You know what I'm saying? Not you, but me. Sure. Too fancy. But we'll have Wyatt Reed on. He'll be talking about some of the censorship, the high-tech censorship going on right now about the Russian war on deep state Ukrainian Banderite Nazis, a term Vladimir Putin used. Did you see that, Rod? That Vladimir Putin's out there talking. It's like he's been listening to the show for 4 years. Or we weren't on for 4 years, but I've been on Sputnik for 4 years. But it's like he's been listening to my reporting. I've been talking. How long have I been talking about Stefan Bandera, Rod? Do you remember even?
About 3.5 years, I would say. About 3.5 years.
Right. Constantly. And it's like nobody, you know where I had this before was when I got back from Lebanon. I came back from Lebanon, and at the time, no one had heard of ISIS. And I was talking about ISIS, and I thought I was talking about like Saturday morning, like Electra Woman and Dinah Girl, Mighty ISIS. That's an old Saturday morning reference for old people. Mark, do you remember those shows? Remember the Mighty ISIS on Saturday mornings?
I don't think I do remember that. Was it in the 80s? Because I don't remember anything from the 80s.
No, it was, but and we respect you for that. But no, this is from the late 70s. There was Electra Woman and Dinah Girl. There was the Mighty ISIS. There were kind of live-action cartoons, I believe, on the ABC television network.
Well, that passed me by.
Yeah, it was post-Puffin stuff, certainly. And I think Puffin stuff may have been your problem in the 80s. Is that what you're implying, Mark?
It could be, yeah.
Could be. But, and don't worry, the boom's coming. But when I came back from Lebanon and I was talking about ISIS, no one knew what the hell I was talking about. they thought I'd made stuff up. And I'm like, no, you'll be hearing about this very soon. I've been talking about the Bandera thing for years. Now Vladimir Putin's out there explicitly talking about Banderites and Ukrainian Nazis and stuff we've been talking about here on Sputnik for a few years. So finally, it's come to pass. Now, in the second hour, we did a pre-taped interview I did with Jareth Kopis. He's the author of a fantastic book called Ukraine Forever a Pawn. And this is a really great, I can say this because I've already done it. This is a great interview with Jareth, very important. And it affected me in my thinking because one of the things I asked Jareth was how he feels about this. And he said, the war, and he said, he's never been happier. You'll hear him say it. And I was thinking about it, I'm like, you know what? Me too, kind of. Really, I am. Because the people that Putin's going after, he's naming who he's going after, and they're the bad guys. And I'll talk about how bad they are in just 1 second. But Mark, say the name of the show and watch what happens.
The backstory.
A lot of gravitas there, Mark. Very impressive.
Very good.
A Liam Neeson level of gravitas there. Well done.
You need to make that a drum trigger.
So, yeah, no, I should. Because I've got a sampler. You know, I could probably easily do that. On my new floor tom that I've got on my kit, that'd be nice. You know, it'd feel good. But anyway, so let me give you credit first, Mark. A few weeks ago on the show, you're a former Marine, is that correct?
Yes. Technically a current Marine, because once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine, like an Eagle Scout. You never really stop.
But you're still an Eagle Scout as well, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like, did you know that Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller is an Eagle Scout as well?
I did. I met him, and did you know he has the original page written in her own hand by Ayn Rand for Atlas Shrugged?
Yeah, I've talked to Penn about Ayn Rand. He started to get into her about the time I knew him. This was in the early 90s.
But he bought at auction the actual, because Ayn Rand wrote her novels in hand and then paid people to type them. And he has the first written page. I think that's just cool. And he says he keeps it up. He keeps a photo of it up in his back room, in his green room.
Well, one of his friends, the way I knew Penn, and I told a really dirty joke that I heard from Penn on the show a couple days ago, but it's a good joke. And one of his close friends is Tim Jennison, the former president, founder, CEO of NewTek, the company that makes the cameras that we use, among other things, and they made the video toaster. And I knew Penn through Tim, who I was working for. And the way I got hired by Tim is I went to their offices in Kansas, and I'd started a newsletter about their products. And when I walked into Tim's office, you know the famous drawn portrait by Ilona of Ayn Rand?
Yes.
You know the one I'm talking about. Anyone who's an objectivist nerd will know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? If we had Carter Laren on, he'd know exactly that. So it's a famous portrait. I walked into Tim's office, and right on the wall was a big picture of Ayn Rand. Now, I didn't know that the guy who was the CEO of the company was a fan of Ayn Rand. But I saw it, and I said to him, Ayn Rand, you know, I went to her funeral. I've been in her apartment. And he said, sit down. We need to talk. Does that make sense? So it's one of those kind of woo-woo things. I don't know. You're not supposed to say that in the same sentence as an Ayn Rand reference. But it's one of those sort of mystical, weird things, coincidences, whatever you want to call it, that when I met the CEO of NewTek, I immediately saw the Ayn Rand thing. And because I had a huge background, because I was at Ayn Rand's burial in Valhalla, New York, not just at the body viewing. I was there when they were burying her. And David Kelly read the Kipling poem If at the side of the grave and so on.
Oh, wow.
And And I've seen. I'll tell you what I've seen that's even
I know David Kelly, by the way. I've been in a hot tub with him.
There we go. Well, if next time you see David, tell him Lee Stranahan says hi. You may remember me. I've talked to him a few times, but not in a while, because I got out of that world. But I'll tell you what I've seen and actually touched. That's almost, I think, more impressive than the first page of Atlas, which is impressive, is Ayn Rand's math homework.
Oh, wow. You mean when she was a kid or something?
No, in her, 80s, she started studying algebra because she was working on epistemology.
Oh, I see.
And she thought that understanding mathematics, algebra, trigonometry, and so on would help her with epistemology. So she studied math from a guy named Herb Grossman. Herb was my math teacher. And Herb was a guy from Yonkers, New York, who was literally, he was part of NBI in the 60s. And Herb was a math teacher at Roosevelt High School in Yonkers. And Herb was hired by Ayn Rand to tutor her in math. And I saw her math homework. And let me tell you one thing about Russia, which you may not know. They do division weird. Do you know that?
It's news to me.
The way we do division is we'll put a number, and then we'll put a line that goes up and then over to the right, and then we'll put another number to the left of it. And you know what I mean, the way we do division. The numbers all come out the same. But Russians do division, at least they did when Ayn Rand was growing up, in a very different style of arranging the numbers. Does that at least make some sense coherently?
A little bit, yeah. I just know a lot of Russians in the mathematical community, and I just haven't seen what you're talking about. But I'll just look it up later.
And they could have changed, because she learned it, again, around the time of the revolution, in the 20s and 30s.
You're not talking about American Common Core, are you?
No. This is Russian core. But anyway, I've seen Ayn Rand's math homework, and it's done in that she had anybody who doesn't know Ayn Rand, when you're talking about she would write out her novels, she had very distinctive, beautiful handwriting. Agreed?
Yes, absolutely. And
So
English wasn't even her primary language. That's what amazed me.
Yes.
If I had a criticism of her books, is they're too long.
Right. She had some trouble editing, maybe. That's possible.
Yeah, she would say the fox went to the river and drank, and then she would say the fox went to the beautiful liquid holding reservoir and drank, and then, she would say it's like she loved talking English and just overdid it. But that's just an Ayn Rand. If you like Ayn Rand, you like it. If you don't, you don't. So.
Right. And to criticize her for that would be like saying, that band Rush from Canada, they play too many notes. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, exactly. Which was their criticism from the anti-pretentious crowd. They're like, they're just pretentious. All they do is go up there and show off. Well, you can't you can't show off if you're pretentious.
No, right.
Well, I mean, you can, but everybody knows you're just being a moron.
The musical term for what they were, and Neil Peart, the drummer for Rush, admitted to this. They were busy, right? That's the musical term. They, Getty, if you listen to Getty, he does little runs up the bass that he doesn't need to. He could just he could do Michael Anthony from Van Halen and just bump, 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 right? That's Michael Anthony. Getty would be bump, bump, right? He'd go up the neck, something like that. And it's not necessary, but it does make it more interesting to play, I think. Don't you agree, Mark? You're probably a busy drummer, aren't you?
Yeah, and it kind of depends on, what the nature of the song is doing. It's like Disturbed with Sound of Silence. That didn't sound hardly anything like the original, but they actually improved upon it and made it very modern, I thought. So,
I'll tell you who we got to get on some Friday when we have you on, Mark. is my friend Alan Bernhoft. Alan was friends with, towards the end of his, not towards the end of his life, Alan's still alive, but towards the end of his life, he was good friends with Hal Blaine.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And Alan's a drummer. And you know, of course, who Hal Blaine is. Hal Blaine is the most recorded drummer in rock history. And you mentioned Simon and Garfunkel. He played on some of their big hits, but also a lot of the Beach Boys songs, Motown songs.
Have you seen The Wrecking Crew? Because he's on that. He's featured heavily in that documentary.
I not only saw it, I saw it premiere and met the director through Alan. And I was sitting next to the guy who's with the Hawks. I can't remember his name. That was Levon Helm's first band. And Alan knew him. Alan knows people like, Alan became friends with, Alan's a longtime friend of mine, 30-some years, 35 years. And Alan, a huge Beatles fan, really knows his stuff, plays every instrument, but plays drums. And he likes Alan's one of those guys, he likes everything. He appreciates Hal Blaine, who was, in a sense, a simple player, but played exactly, I think, the right parts. Would you agree?
Yes, for the song. Even me. I mean, if I was on, for instance, if I was on the Beach Boys, God Only Knows, I would have ruined that song.
Right. You don't need Mitch Mitchell or Ginger Baker or Neil Peart on God Only Knows, right?
Right. Exactly. But what you do need is someone with impeccable time, someone that understands you're not doing a drum solo, you're creating a pop song. And so, yeah, I actually have respect for those folks. It's just not my style of music.
Yeah. Now, and Ingrid, I see I'll get to you in 1 second. I want to give Mark credit first because I said I would, and we got talking about drum stuff, which I love doing with you. But let me give you credit. As an ex or current Marine, whatever, you noted a few weeks ago on the show when we were on with Scott Ritter that the Russian troops, even though they were 100-something miles away from the border, were well poised to go in. And sure enough, that's come to pass. Now they have what I would call an invasion. There are ground troops. They've been in Kiev and other places. They're continuing to move westward. So, Mark, I got to say, congrats to you. You called it completely, that they were in a position to do that. You weren't predicting the future. You were just saying, realistically, they seem to be in a good position. Right, Mark? Do you feel justified?
Well, I think I did make the prediction. I said everything they've done from my study of military strategy, because that's a hobby of mine. I like wargaming and especially World War II creations and stuff like that. And everything they did from a logistics perspective seemed to be preparing for a real, live, actual invasion, not just a feint, not just something where they're trying to rattle a saber, but it looked like that they're wanting to do a real, good old-fashioned invasion, you might say. And the reason you know that, when you invade a country, you don't start right from 1 inch from the border. That's just not how it works. You need a buffer in there so the vehicles can get around and move, and you can coordinate all of the work. You also don't want to be too close to the border in case your enemy attacks you before you attack them. And so everything they were doing was standard military operating procedure from the perspective of how would you invade as a rational person? How would somebody invade a country from the borders that Russia has into Ukraine? And it looked clearly to me that it wasn't just that it wasn't just rattling sabers, that they were serious. Because that's what you do when you make a real invasion. When we invaded Kuwait, we didn't go right up to the edge and then have all of our vehicles bumper to bumper. That's not, that would be chaos. They'd be bumping into each other all over the place. No, it's a controlled, direct fire assignment. And what this whole thing has opened up my mind to, I've always known the mainstream media was kind of the same thing. I've always, they have their little difference here and there, but at the end of the day, in a way, it's like 0 degrees versus 360 degrees. And what I find just utterly fascinating is well, for instance, last night I just hopped back and forth between CNN and Fox for about 5 minutes. About every 30 seconds, I would switch to the other station. And they were both up in arms. I mean, they had the propaganda machine on high. And because from a logical perspective, even if, let's say you are a smart and reasonable person, you think Vladimir Putin is the Antichrist, you think he's just the worst thing to exist ever, you can't stand Russians, all of that stuff, even if all of that's true, there is still a perspective that is worth discussing as to why this situation ended up the way it is in the first place. And that's what disappointed me in the media. I mean, all of the sources I went to go look at as an experiment were just trash.
Well, Mark, in the second hour, you and I will discuss that, because I have a theory I'm going to lay on you, and it involves, believe it or not, at the beginning, because, you know, I'm kind of weird the way I talk about things, but it will involve...
kind of weird.
It involves one of the chief products of Georgia, the area you're in, Coca-Cola. I'm going to explain from a Coca-Cola, using that as an analogy, the propaganda war in the second hour, because this interview with Jareth Kappas really brings out a lot of that stuff. It's a fantastic interview, so people won't want to miss that. But let me ask you, so doing what you were talking about, separating out whether you like Putin, agree with Russia, I've been clear, and I'll be more clear as the show goes on, that I've said I stand with Russia on this one. Russia, I think, is, and Putin is exactly right, and what he's doing is exactly significant, because as someone pointed out on Twitter yesterday, what they're doing is Putin is not going after Ukraine. He's going after the United States deep state in Ukraine. That's what he's going after. And that's why it's significant. And I'll talk about that next hour. But let me ask you, Mark, without separate out whether you agree with Russia or Putin or whatever, if you're looking at this purely from a military execution point of view, as someone who's in the Marines, looking at how they've done, does that make sense? Just looking at it purely, I'll put it like this. Like if someone's robbing a bank and they have a getaway driver, you can oppose robbing banks. But if the getaway driver is a good driver and does some fancy moves, you can still say, I oppose robbing the bank, but that guy's a good driver. Does that make sense? So that's what I wanted to see. You as a Marine, Mark, how do you think Russia's done militarily thus far?
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's worth talking about it every chance that anybody has an opportunity for. I was a brand new professor right after 9/11, and the campus media office wanted to, because I had expertise in monetary economics, war on drugs, and logistics, and they wanted to get me on to talk about the economy, and they had some other people on. And so I just said something like, well, you can't say that you can't say that Osama bin Laden is irrational. He hit the center of American military power. He hit the center of American economic power, and he tried to hit the center of American political power. And so when that happened, I was just like, wow, I wonder if we're going to overreact to this. I wonder what we're actually going to do about this. And it turned out to be a very similar thing, Lee. It just was something that didn't pass the common sense test to me. That's just how I looked at it.
Right. Now, so militarily here, how do you view the current situation?
Well, the current situation, militarily, from a military perspective, all we're talking about is guerrilla war. This thing will be over in a few days. Now, the question is, let's define the word over. What does over mean? Will there still be trace elements of terrorist resurgence and and resistance? Yes. There was after World War II, by the way. The last terrorist act by the Nazis was about 18 months after the war ended. So it isn't like they just flicked the switch and everything became pretty and easy. And it's the same way in the Ukraine. It's I don't see any way how they can stop this. It's if they fight. It's almost a loser's game in game theory. If they fight, they lose their city, and now they have rubble. Now the battle will be Stalingrad until that's mopped up, or they capitulate and they open up the city. One of the two has to happen because they simply do not have the ability to fight a organization on the level of the Russian military.
Yes, and yeah. Go ahead, Mark. I don't want to get angry, but
yeah, I was just going to say it would be like telling Iraq to hang in there, keep fighting, because eventually you'll get us. Well, no, they didn't. There was no way Iraq could have won. They weren't fighting an enemy that was equal to them. Russia's a real military power, and they have real military weapons, and they have a real military that they really do real exercises on, and it's a formidable opponent. And so I don't see this thing going on very much longer, to be honest. I mean, I just don't. I mean, absolutely, there's going to be the Ukraine, there's going to be the Ukraine, Freedom Fund and the Ukraine, Liberation Front or whatever. But this is over, as far as I can tell.
There we go. 202-521-1320. Ingrid, thanks for holding. What's on your mind?
Well, I want to wind up commenting on something one of your callers said yesterday. But first, thank you so much for covering this the way you're doing. And I'm with you and Jared Kopis. I am really pleased. And Mark seems to not want to answer directly your question. I give Putin an A+ so far from what we know, if we can believe it, for coming. By
the way, I just for the record, I don't agree. I thought Mark did a great job of answering the question, but there we go. So keep going, Ingrid.
Well, I didn't think he answered it at all. You asked how was Putin doing, and he answered by saying that the Ukrainians had no chance. And okay, whatever. Yesterday you had, first off, I'm very disappointed by the way the people in the peace movement have reacted to this. And I get all kinds of emails every day saying, oh, let's get out and protest this and that. And the degree to which the standard peaceniks have responded to this has been to condemn Russia. And I'm so disappointed in them. And the only people who've come out and said anything halfway reasonable is PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, who I normally don't even bother to read their emails. And so I'm a little miffed about that. But anyway, yesterday...
Well, I think what I have to say in the second hour, Ingrid, because we got to go to a break here, I think when people understand the level of propaganda, what I'll say is, and I'll use Coke as an analogy, but what we're witnessing is one of the most expensive, most intricate propaganda campaigns in the history of the world. It's been going on, backed by the U.S. CIA and the U.S. State Department for decades. The Ukrainian operation, and it's not debatable that billions have been spent on this operation. And what I'm saying is, if you spend $1 billion advertising something, you're going to get people wanting it, whether it's a good product or not. And you may see where I'm going with the Coke thing right there, Mark. But let's take a short break. When we come back, Wyatt Reed, media producer and correspondent for Sputnik, will be joining us right after this on The Backstory.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
And we're back, 105.5 FM, AM 1390 in Washington, D.C. If you're driving around, possibly shaking your fist at the radio, then you, I guess, work for the military-industrial complex, which I understand the rent's very high in D.C., so you need a job. I get that. And those Porsches don't buy themselves. But that's where we are, 105.5 FM, AM 1390. It's the best damn radio show in the world. Now, joining us is Sputnik correspondent and news analyst Wyatt Reed. Hey, Wyatt, how you doing?
I'm good, Lee. How about yourself?
I'm groovy, sir. Thanks very much. Now, Wyatt, I'm going to do with you what I've done with everybody so far. I'm just going to leave the floor open. What do you think of what's going on since military action began a couple of days ago? What's your take on it in whatever way you want to talk about it? Wyatt?
Thanks, Lee. Well, I guess to open up with, I guess I'll start by pushing back on the idea that a couple days ago is when, military incursions started happening in this region of the world. This is something that's been going on since 2014, since the end of 2014, since, this situation really kind of came to a head, and you had the establishment of the LPR, DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic. So hostilities have been ongoing for many, many, many years. Over 13,000 people have died in that region, 80% of them on the Russian-leaning side, I should add. So really, hostilities didn't begin this week, and I think that's an important point to make because we're not hearing that on the mainstream media. We're hearing that, Putin just woke up one day and decided, you know what, time to press the button, I'm bored. No, Putin is reacting rationally to a long-term threat, to effectively what is a NATO U.S. sort of battleship, military base right off the edge of their borders. You had the Ukrainian prime minister start talking about, president start talking about their desire to acquire nuclear weapons. You had NATO talking about, maybe potentially moving in missile installations here to be even closer than the ones they currently have in Poland to Russia. So, you have to situate this situation. You have to contextualize all of this information within this kind of broader circumstances that have been going on for the past 8 years, which, when you do that, you can't avoid coming to the conclusion that this was more or less inevitable since the U.S. and since NATO started going down this path of kind of pushing Ukraine, pushing them. I was listening to a lecture that very well-known international relations expert John Marsheimer, a lecture that he gave years ago, right, 7 or 8 years ago, where he described what was happening. He said, this can only end with Ukraine getting wrecked because they're getting led down the primrose path by the U.S. and by NATO, by these people who have no intention, when push comes to shove, of actually backing up the Ukrainians. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing their military absolutely obliterated, the naval capabilities practically non-existent, all of their air defense systems totally eliminated, and you look to the West and they're saying, well, we'll help you flee. That's their message to Zelensky right now. They're saying, well, we'll try to funnel you some weapons. Not entirely clear how they can even get them into Ukraine, given that much of the border is now controlled by Russian forces, given that many of the airports are now controlled by Russian forces. It's not even clear to me how they're going to try to funnel in weapons to this counterinsurgency that they now seem to be wanting to generate in Ukraine. But in the meantime, it's sad, right? You have people who are not interested in becoming cannon fodder in Zelensky's feud and his reckless sort of policy of aggression that they have pursued towards Russia. You have people fleeing, and then all of these men aged 18 to 60 are being pulled out, beaten if they refuse, forced at gunpoint to become cannon fodder, to be conscripted into this army that has not a snowball's chance in hell of beating back one of the world's most developed and most advanced militaries.
Well, okay, so Wyatt, I agree with everything you're saying. And let me go, I think, possibly a little further, maybe to the point of almost swearing, but don't worry, I'm a professional, Saul. I'm not going to swear. But let me put it bluntly, part of what I think is going on here, and then get your reaction to it, Wyatt, see if you agree, or if I've gone a bridge too far here. I think part of what's going on is that the United States has basically ignored what Russia's been saying for about 8 years, right? And that is in particular in the past few months, Russia's been saying, here's a list of our demands. This is what we want. We don't want any further NATO encroachment. We want you to stop shelling people in the Donbass. And basically, the West reaction, our government, the United States government's reaction, was to ignore it. Ignore. Never even respond to it. And then here comes the part where I'm almost going to swear. And that Putin's response now is basically, ignore this, Mother Hubbard. You follow me? Mm-hmm. Boom. See if you can ignore this. And boom, the bombs start dropping and people start walking in with guns. Would you agree that that's part of what's going on here?
Absolutely, 100%. And, the tragic part, again, is that these people who were lied to for years by our government, right, which just gave them these nonsensical, total absurd, just entertained these ideas of, yeah, sure, Ukraine can join NATO. That terrifies the Russians, right? Makes the Ukrainians feel great because they get to puff their chest out. They get to see, this faction of I shouldn't even say the Ukrainians. I should say the Ukrainian regime, the coup-born regime that seized power in 2014, and the Ukrainian nationalists who have these extremely anti-Russian sentiments. Those people, Ukrainians in general, not a monolith here, but those people, they were suckered into this arrangement and they fell for it. They fell for it hook, line, and sinker because they wanted to believe that they would get a chance one day to, annihilate the Russian bear. And that was never going to happen. I think most international relations analysts who have any sense in their brains will tell you that was never going to happen. That was never a serious option behind closed doors. At least at this point in time, maybe 5 years from now, maybe, who knows? And I guess that's a big part of the calculation by the Russian government right now is, they say some things for certain periods of time, and then things change, right? This agreement that took place 30 years ago, in which the U.S. and Clinton promised that NATO expansion would cease, and then year after year after year, we see the opposite take place. We see NATO pushing closer and closer to Russia's borders. We see more open sort of Cold War style feuding going on in theaters like Syria. And then you have this kind of situation where leaders in Moscow start to understand, like, look, we have to draw a line in the sand, right? Because we're dealing with people who, basically, I mean, when you talk about the swamp, when you talk about what's in Washington, it's a bunch of rich baby bullies, right? It's a bunch of people who've never really had to deal with actual adversity in their life. They've never really had to deal with the quote unquote real world. They've all sort of lived in this bubble existence where, they have this power within the swamp, and the swamp has this power over the nation. The nation has this swamp over the entire world. And so they've never actually come up against their own limitations. And right now you see people losing their minds, right? Because they're realizing for the first time in their entire lives that U.S. military hegemony, which has always gone unchallenged, is coming to an end. And that, hold on, we're not the only ones who can go around and do whatever we want. Hold on, now all of a sudden, all these people, I'm sure they feel pretty sheepish of, that's probably an understatement, but this is certainly, it's kind of a moment of a reckoning. I watched the commander of the Supreme Allied Forces of NATO hop on CNN last night, and the guy could barely get a talking point out. He was totally off game. He was really out of his element because I think he was kind of dealing with this reality, right? It was still wrapping his mind around the fact that the world is not the world that he grew up in, the world that he thought he knew. It's a new world, right? And I don't mean that in some, terrifying new world order, but it is a new world in that it is multipolar, in that the rest of the world doesn't have to say how high when Uncle Sam says jump.
No, and they're finally dealing with someone in Vladimir Putin who has not only the will now, but the ability. He can, in other words, he can back it up. It's one thing if you're a smug student council member and you're picking on somebody for, as a freshman, you beat him up and stuff in a locker. As a sophomore, you throw his lunch on him, whatever. But then he's been working out all summer, and now it's senior year, and you're at the prom, and suddenly it's carry time. You follow me? It's Sissy Spacek time. And you're going, wait a second. Vladimir Putin is showing this is what happens when someone's had enough and has the most advanced military in the world, right? Because that's what's happening. Now, Wyatt, let me introduce you to our guest host today, Mark Frost. Mark, Wyatt, Mark.
Pleasure.
Hi, Wyatt. Nice to meet you.
You too, Mark.
Okay, Mark, you have a question for Wyatt. Go ahead.
This has been a central theme that we've been talking about lately across this, especially on a military kind of economic, political economy perspective. Ukraine hasn't even been a country for very long. What is it, 20 years or something? And Russia has been complaining about the border situation since the fall of the USSR. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And their big worry was that here we go again. We're going to have Western powers right up to our gate with no buffer. And that's why I like to bring up Mongolia. Tried to join the USSR. They really wanted to join the USSR as protection from China. And the Soviets would not allow them to join because they liked having that buffer there between them and China. Ditto between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. It's this whole thing could have been avoided, it seems to me, if Biden just would have said, you know what, we've thought about your point of view, it's reasonable, we're going to let Belarus and Ukraine, they'll stay out of NATO. The whole thing could have been avoided, it seems to me. But on an area of my expertise, game theory, I think this is Biden's doing indirectly. Putin nobody would have ever done this to Trump. Whether you like Trump or hate Trump, love him, whatever your opinion of Trump is, Trump had a perception by foreign leaders, and they would not have done this to Trump. They were a little bit afraid of Trump. And sometimes we call that respect. And I think Biden has become such an impotent president that I think the real signal of all this, what I'm looking at, is what's going to be happening in Taiwan next week. Because this is a clear neon sign. It's a signal to China that just says, okay, just what Wyatt was talking about earlier. We're a toothless dragon. We could do something, but we never really will. We might launch a cruise missile into a tent or something like that. And my suspicion is that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, Wyatt? It's definitely speculation. I guess probably the term the Chinese would use would be paper tiger. That's certainly the way that, the U.S. has come off looking at all of this. It's hard for me to say. I don't know that the calculus is necessarily quite the same in Moscow and in Beijing. Specifically with Ukraine, which means borderlands, in terms of Russia. So that's the history of that word. Even it's always been, part of this kind of Russian sphere of influence. The first capital of Russia being Kiev, right? So this is not. We're not talking about Russians going off over to to Iraq or something, someplace 5,000 miles across the world. They're not even crossing any body of water. It is obviously a pretty analogous situation with Taiwan, and it's I mean, it's pretty funny, obviously, to hear people kind of blustering about how we need to do this and that in Taiwan. Well, it's how about we just stop trying to encircle groups of people who we perceive to be like competing powers, and how about we try to start cooperating with people in some regard, because that's our MO for the past 70 years has been just bully anyone who gets in your way, including your allies, right? Including, Gough Whitlam in Australia. He gets overthrown because he doesn't want a CIA base anymore, right? Let me, I guess, to kind of put this all together, I think maybe even the mentality around how we approach Taiwan is just kind of backwards, right? Like, can we imagine if Russia or China proposed setting up, in Cuba, massive military defenses? I mean, you don't even have to think too hard, right? You think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened, right? And how do we collectively remember that? Well, we collectively remember it as kind of an aggressive act that the Soviets came over here and wanted to jam their missiles right up our noses. That's how Chinese people perceive Taiwan, which, to use the same metaphor, is effectively an American aircraft carrier more so than a sovereign state. That's, I don't think Americans' interests are served at all by pontificating about, oh, well, what should we do in Eastern Europe? Oh, what should we do in the South China Sea? How about what should we do in America? That's our country. That's my sphere of interest. That's where all the people who I know hang out in is on this continent. Not, I've never been to Europe, and neither have 90% of Americans. So, to me, again, it just kind of comes back to this whole concept of, the U.S. has to be the world police. And I think it's outdated. And honestly, I think the sooner we give it up, the safer we all are, and the more money we have to spend on actual things that improve our standards of living here at home, instead of dumping a bunch of Javelin missiles off with the Ukrainians so that they can hand them over to Russia.
Now, let me ask you one question, Wyatt, too, because you're a news analyst and you're a correspondent over here at Sputnik. So you're into news. You didn't get this job and then suddenly discover news. But I'm just curious on a personal level, how obsessed have you been? Because I'm going to plead guilty. I'm completely, as soon as the show ends, I go sit on my couch with my iPad and I start going through Twitter and everything. All I'm doing in the past few days is following different news sources, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. So how personally obsessive have you become about this since tensions have broken out, Wyatt?
Oh man,
Just curious.
It's actually kind of bad. I'm not sleeping great. Like I'm staying up till like 4 or 5 in the morning, and just No, I mean I don't want to say it's stressful, but it's very hard not to think about. And even when I'm trying to do normal things, I just thoughts will be popping into my mind. I wonder if how Zelensky has responded to such and such. Oh, are they actually going to have a sit-down meeting? Just in terms of the latest, I don't know if you guys got into this. It sounds like there are attempts to work out some kind of sit-down meeting. That the Moscow wanted that to be in Minsk. That was shot down by the Ukrainians who wanted it to be in Poland. Supposedly the Russians haven't heard back since. I know Turkey at some point has offered Ankara as a space for that negotiations. But I'm just like you. I'm kind of just following every little news feed that I can get, seeing all these videos. A lot of them, especially the ones that are kind of more pro-Ukrainian coup regime, are just total nonsense. You'll find like 5 versions of the same video, and each one says something completely different about who it is and where it is and what's happening.
Well, you must have seen that thing the New York Post ran. Forgive me for interrupting you, Wyatt. I just want to make sure we get to everything. There's a lot to get to. Appreciate you coming on the show. Always great to talk to you. Yeah. But you must have seen the New York Post headline that the Russian tank had maliciously rolled over the civilian car, and it turned out to be complete BS. You must have seen that, right, Wyatt?
Yeah, I saw that. I'm struggling to recall exactly what city it is, but yeah, there was this very horrifying video that showed Ukrainian armored vehicle basically just completely steamrolling the civilian passenger car. Really horrifying stuff. And then, you saw it first, and the New York Post says, oh, well, that was a Russian vehicle. And then, well, hold on, it's not a Russian vehicle. They backtrack. And then you see people kind of go into propaganda mode online. They say, well, the Russians have commandeered certain Ukrainian military equipment, so it must be Russians in a Ukrainian vehicle who did it. And okay. So that's kind of where we're at with that little narrative right now. I think, honestly, I have no idea what happened in there. We do know that is a Ukrainian military vehicle. We can't say for sure that man, who was driving and actually wanted to do what he did. Maybe he just didn't see the car. Maybe he was a psychopath. I don't know. But
well, one of the things about the era we live in, where everyone's got a camera now, including over in Ukraine, because everyone's got a cell phone, multiple video angles seem to show it was an accident. The guy was heading into a live fire area, trying to avoid it. Does that make sense?
Right.
That's what it seems like from looking at multiple angles. And by the way, if it were Russian or Ukrainian, I'm just, whatever happened, it looks like an accident, whoever did it. And it looks like a Ukrainian did it. And I'm not trying to get him off the hook. I'm trying to say that's what it looks like to me. But let's talk about this story you've been looking at, Wyatt, that places like Twitter seem to be suspending. They said it was an accident, right? But some certain accounts are being suspended. Talk about the internet censorship people should watch out for now. Wyatt Reed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's been a number of efforts to silence outlets like Sputnik, outlets like RT, especially in Europe. You have British politicians begging for the regulatory agency Ofcom to basically strip RT of its ability to broadcast, just ban them unilaterally from the air. Boris Johnson's been, harumphing about that for a few days. But, beyond those kind of legalistic things, then you have this story about like Zero Hedge last week, right, which unnamed, of course, American intelligence officials accused of spreading Russian propaganda in this big AP hit piece. Obviously they have no links whatsoever to Russia, but, just because they are perceived as being a little too sympathetic in the same way that, Tucker Carlson is perceived as too sympathetic to Russia because he urges us to try to understand what their perspective might be. He must be a Russian asset, right?
So that Tulsi Gabbard.
Right. Tulsi Gabbard, she must be a Putin lover, right? That's the only possible
no other possibility could even even apply.
Yeah. Right, exactly. And so in the context of all of this, one outlet that I've been following pretty extensively is called ASB Military. ASB Military News.
Great Twitter feed. Yes, one of my obsessions. Absolutely.
Yeah, they're one of my go-to feeds, and they were suspended for 12 hours from Twitter in the run-up to all this, and really right before it all kicked off. They were suspended for 12 hours. No justification was given, even when Twitter sends you this little warning when they've suspended you. It says, you have committed a violation of Twitter rules. The violation was, and then it leaves a little space, and they'll tell you, well, you did such and such. In this warning that they were sent, or really their suspension they were sent, there was not even a reason given, right? It was just, you did something. We're not even going to tell you what. You can't refute that because you're not even being accused of anything. They hadn't, as far as they were aware, published anything untrue. So really it came across as just an extremely open attempt to silence them politically. They said that it happened almost, just within hours of them very openly and publicly mocking Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, when he made this very absurd tweet kind of talking about all the things that Russian elite would no longer be able to access, like diamonds in Antwerp, apparently not realizing that Russia is the #1 diamond producer in the world. And, they mocked him for this tweet and started getting more attention on it, and he very quickly deleted it. And then they were banned a few hours later. And obviously there's no real direct causation smoking gun right there, but that was a factor that they expressed to me. When I spoke to them, I published an article about this. It's on Sputnik News. If anyone wants to or cares to follow up on this, the article is called "Journalists Suspended from Twitter Condemn Blatant Censorship Over Russia Views." But they, now they're back, and I'm happy to hear it because they're providing an extremely important public service, especially given, as we've talked about, the just wave, right, that we've been inundated with of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, gray propaganda, all types of information just kind of being jammed into our brains, trying to make us turn them off to any possibility other than, like, we need to rah, 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 support Ukraine, give them whatever they want, any kind of weapons, sanction Russia till it's, there's nothing left to sanction. This is kind of the, hysteria that's on every TV channel right now, every newspaper that you open. So, I am glad to see that sites like this, which are able to provide sort of counter propaganda, which are able to help those of us who are trying to push the truth out there, have primary sources, and that there's somebody out there that's vetting that information, so it's not, all this kind of crazy nonsense. So we're not doing the same thing that, the mainstream corporate media does.
And we're almost out of time. Fantastic appearance by Reed, but I'm sure you've also seen that ASB Military has been critical of Putin and critical of Russia a number of times. You've seen that, right?
Yeah, no. And again, I think this is kind of what separates us from the people on the other side. We have the ability to be critical of things that we don't like. We're not going to get excommunicated from the swamp just because we say things how we really feel.
That's a great point. People definitely check out Wyatt's work. Wyatt Reed, correspondent, political analyst. Love to have you on anytime you want to come on, Wyatt. And it's nice to be talking to you when you're not in a South American or Central American country, because it seems like every time we talk to you recently, I'm not knocking those. The weather's probably nicer. But I'm just saying, it's the first time we've talked to Wyatt Reed when he's been in America at the same time. We got more coming up. It's Frosty Friday with Mark Frost. I'm Lee Stranahan here on the best damn radio show in the world. It's The Backstory.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are back. It is time for the last hour of the week, because it's a Friday and, we're not here on the weekend, of the best damn radio show in the world. I'm investigative journalist Lee Stranahan. This is a show that brings you the truth behind the headlines. This is The Backstory. And it is a frosty Friday. We're joined by guest co-host Mark Frost. Always great to have Mark on. It's a pleasure to talk to Mark. And this is one of the things I really like about these guest host things. It's people who, my first wife used to say about some people, she would never get out there visit with them. And I understand what she means about that. By the way, she eventually got out to visit with me, apparently. But I understand that. And Mark's just one of those guys, if Mark lived close, he's in Georgia, I'm in South Dakota right now, I would absolutely love to go out to dinner with Mark sometime, or just to a Waffle House at 2 a.m. You know what I'm saying, Mark? I'm not saying you have to pretend you like me, but go ahead. It's nice if you would.
It is. I'll even bring my bong.
So joining us this hour, we have Jareth Koppes in a pre-taped interview. And Wyatt Reed led us into the topic that I want to get to. But Mark, do me a favor. You did such a great job last time. Say the name of the show. Let's watch what happens.
The Backstory.
I am going to get that. Multifaceted Engineer Saul, that boom, do we have that as a separate sound file?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, if you could mail that to me. I'm serious. I'm going to have my drums trigger it. I'm not even joking. Mark gave me a great idea. And Mark, it can be sort of like, when Neil Peart would do his drum solo, when he started to do the electronic version, where it'd have like the big band samples. Of course, what I'm talking about, Mark.
Sure.
Right? So that's how I'm going to use it, sort of a almost as a symbol. Does it make sense? Just the orchestral hit there.
Yeah. Set it up as a trigger.
Right. I'm going to put on my big floor tom with the steampunk graphic on it. It's fantastic. Now, 202-521-1320. I want to get to Tarifa and Owl Killer. Let's start by going to Tarifa real quickly. Then when we come back, I'll talk about propaganda in Ukraine and Coca-Cola. Tarifa, what's on your mind?
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you. Free Julian Assange. Okay, here I go. It's hashtag denazification. The situation in Ukraine is this. Putin have free range now. The U.S. and NATO would have showed their hand. They only can do so much with Swiss. Either they keep them on or take them off. It doesn't matter. They're working with China and, yes, India too. So Putin's going to secure the Caucasus region, the UAEs, or things of that nature. And Mr. Frost was right about Taiwan. Taiwan is next. I guarantee y'all, both of y'all and the people that's listening to this right now, that they had Chinese generals and admirals, Cuban generals, Venezuelan and Iranian generals that was in that headquarters in Russia, seeing in real time what was taking place. What equipment was used, what psychological warfare was used against the population of Ukraine, and other type of things. A blueprint was established on in the first hour. So when the Chinese generals and admirals go back to China, they're going to map up their plan to deal with Taiwan. Well, I don't know how long it's going to be when they deal with them, but the same thing that happened with Ukraine is going to be the same thing going to happen with Taiwan. A psychological thing happened out there. Not all Ukrainians was for the regime. They might have didn't like the Kremlin or Russia, but with all those videos coming out of Ukraine showing troop movement of Ukrainian equipment, giving out the spots of the Ukrainian artillery pieces behind buildings like that. The Russians did that purposely. They could have knocked out all the communications, but they knew the population was going to use those cell phones. They got IP addresses and GPS trackers on each cell phone now to locate those things. Now, if the Russians want, they can knock them out from the sky. The Russians know what they're doing, and China going to use the same thing. Going to use the population against the Taiwanese population against their own military. It's going to be the same thing. Watch what I tell you. Thank you.
Now, great call as usual, Tarif. Mark, Tarif was kind of agreeing with you, or he was agreeing with you. I won't even say kind of. He was agreeing with you. So therefore, I'm going to ask you what you think of what Tarif said, and I assume you're going to say you agree with Tarif agreeing with you, right? Mark, do you want to amplify anything?
Well, I always like what he has to say, especially when he agrees with me. This isn't really so much an agreement of anything, of just reading the tea leaves. It's just, I mean, from a selfish analytical perspective, let's just go into Aristotelian selfishness. I don't have any great deep love for Russia or Ukraine. I have probably 2 Ukrainian friends, maybe a dozen Russian friends. So other than that, I don't have any love for those 2 countries like I do my own in that particular sense. But what is pretty clear is that leaders, from a game theoretic perspective, that is from a strategy perspective, people make their decisions based upon what they think their opponent is going to do. If you think your opponent is coming with knives to a knife fight, you're going to bring a gun, right? I mean, it's just, it's the nature of how the strategy being involved changes what's going on in the first place. And so it seems to me that if I was China, if I was the leader of China, I would be watching very closely what's going on in the Ukraine, because this isn't just a Russia-Ukraine thing. This is impacting the whole world. I've been an inflation hawk for years. And if you think you've seen inflation now, well, just get ready. You're going to see some more. You're going to see higher fuel prices. You're going to see higher product prices. You're going to see a supply chain already under stress, even more at stress now as we put more and more sanctions on, and they take measures to go around the sanctions. And I'm not sure anybody's winning. I don't think the Ukrainians are winning. And so from a historical, economic, selfish perspective, it seems to me Tarif was right.
Now, let me ask you this, Mark, because you are an expert on game theory. And looking at what you know about Vladimir Putin, just from what you see, again, you don't know the guy, I don't know the guy. But do you think that there's any way he did not game out knowing that when he took this action, there would be sanctions and so on? Because I don't see how it's possible. Right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that there's anybody who thinks that Vladimir Putin's going to be shocked by sanctions. I think, I guarantee you, he and whoever's advising him looked at that carefully, and basically they're at a position now that they're sanctioning. This is in the headlines now. They're going to sanction Putin. They're going to sanction Lavrov. They're sanctioning everybody. I
that's
assume
a two-edged sword too. I mean, sanctions are a two-edged sword. And it's one of those things that it's almost impossible to surgically sanction. You either, to do it successfully, you got to turn them completely off. And to do that requires pain. Let's call it, casualties, if you will, collateral damage casualties from the fallout of all this. And it's definitely going to impact world prices. It's going to impact world politics, but it also has dramatically altered the perception of other world leaders. Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and he risked, unsuccessfully, losing power rather than just say, hey guys, I've been BSing all this time. I don't really have any weapons of mass destruction. I don't have any weapons of mass mass destruction anymore. Well, he couldn't say that because of Iran. If he said that, his primary invisible club that he would threaten Iran with was his chemical weapons. And so we Americans sometimes make the mistake of doing what Wyatt talked about in the last segment. We have never really known war, hardship, anything what I would consider what a lot of people in the world go through these days. And it's made us a little bit soft. There's other considerations going on in the world besides just what the United States thinks. There's other people in the world that has to be taken into consideration with this. And if you look at Taiwan, it's not just the leadership, it's the leaderships within China's, their own perception of what the other leadership is wanting to do. It's a precarious position of chess where you have to anticipate what the other person's going to be doing before you even know what you want to be doing. And that's why the world is a dangerous place right now. We've lost that. Right now we're in a sense of mild chaos, it seems to me, and it's self-imposed.
Yeah, now, and we'll talk about that later, but we got a bunch of calls, and I still want to talk about looking at this from a propaganda point of view. But let's go to Owl Killer real quickly. Owl Killer, what's on your mind, sir?
So, like I predicted, the war was inevitable. People in the know knew that the war was going to be inevitable in Ukraine. I want to mention a few things. So Vladimir also said that no matter what anybody's reaction is, the decision has already been made to counter every one of those reactions. If they are taking off SWIFT, you can kiss the dollar as a reserve currency goodbye. Because if you think that they don't already have a plan with China or a plan with other countries like Iran that don't, who already want to decouple from the dollar, you got another thing coming. And I mean, you saw President Biden talking about how we are going to be hit with higher gas prices, higher food prices because of this. I think everything in motion is this great reset, and this is just whether we push them to react this way or not. This is just a way for them to justify what is going to come, our fiscal irresponsibility, and we're going to blame it on whatever's going on in Ukraine and Russia. But this is 30 to 50 years of fiscal irresponsibility, and unfortunately, when all else fails, they take you to war.
So I where you lost, the only place you lost me there, Al Killer, was the last part, because I don't is saying that somehow this was part of like Klaus Schwab's plan, and almost like you were saying. I don't think so. I don't think that's what's going on, but I agree with you up to there. And Mark Frost, you're in a perfect position to explain about the SWIFT thing and whether you think what Al Killer is saying about SWIFT and decoupling from that is correct. Mark Frost.
As intense as he seemed to explain it, but yeah, it's definitely something that's on. This is one of those things I was talking about. What are the unintended consequences of us doing this? And it's not just SWIFT itself, because there's other ways to transfer money. There's other ways to do international online banking than just using SWIFT. But SWIFT is it's the most significant medium, and it sends a signal, and it just escalates the thing more and more and more. Russia is not going to be devastated if they're taken off SWIFT. There's other ways to move money around accounts. It's just SWIFT and companies like SWIFT make it easier. And just to point out, SWIFT is not an American company. It's a Belgian. It's an EU company. And just like with Iran, the way we get them to do what we want is we threaten to take ourselves off of the SWIFT net. That's how we have control over them, just so everybody knows. We don't have any direct control. Biden can't pick up the phone and say, stop this. You can't have Russia as a client. They can't do that. They're not under U.S. jurisdiction. But the U.S. can take themselves out of the organization and say, okay, you don't have access to the United States anymore, or our possessions, or our international corporations. And so it just puts a poison pill into And so that bends the arm of SWIFT and its competitors who have similar things.
Yes, and a very important point there, and I think people should understand that, is that this is not something we directly control. Almost like the Nord Stream 2 thing, we have no direct, that was a deal between Russia and Germany. And the U.S. didn't really have any direct stuff that they could do on that. And it's already built, and all that was happening was being certified. Now they've suspended, not canceled, is my understanding. And we'll see if at the end of the day, Germany wants to pay much higher gas prices. Because what that means is you've got a new administration in there who's one of the first things is German people who are already pretty feisty about COVID. You've seen that in the protests over there, want to pay higher gas prices. Because I don't think the German people care. Do you see what I'm getting at there, Mark?
Yes.
That we'll see whether Germany wants to go through with that. And we'll see how loyal Germany is to the United States. And I think at the end of the day, the answer is going to be not that loyal. And the same reason I don't think France will be after that submarine debacle, but that's another story. Saul, who we got next?
We have David and then Rachel.
Okay, so David, then Rachel. David from New York, correct?
David from New York.
David from New York, that was from memory. Hey, David, how you doing? Nice to have you back in the show. What's on your mind?
Second time caller. The goal of denazification sounds like a really good thing, but in practice, it's not going to be so easy. The Western half, I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I just started it. The Western half of Ukraine is pretty much permeated by anti-Russian sentiment. So how do you really can't get rid of that so easily? It's like a prejudice that you can't just snap your fingers or militarily eradicate. That's the first thing. So denazification, while it sounds like a good thing, in practice it's not going to be so easy. The second thing is a question. With regard to the claims of Nazi infiltration of the military and the political process in Ukraine, how does the West respond to that? Do they respond at all, or do they just omit the discussion of it? How does
David? That's a great question. The answer is they respond by saying it's Russian disinformation. They say that there's no. That's what they say. That is their response. And let me tell you, the one thing Putin's made very clear in statements recently is that they are going to go in. Do you know what they're going to do? They're going to hold. And I'll give one specific, the Odessa massacre. Putin has said, we know who did the Odessa massacre. If anyone thinks Russia has spent 8 years just idly, watching reality TV or something, they've not. They know who's behind Odessa. And Putin has said, in as clear terms as possible, we're going to bring those people to justice. So what he's going to do is the people who... The denazification, I'll put it like this. If he'd gone in and assassinated Goebbels and Hitler, that wouldn't have gotten rid of every Nazi, but it would have sent a very strong message. And that's what I think Putin intends to do. And the reason I think he intends to do that is because he said it. And I think, by the way, let me point out something that's happened in the past few weeks. U.S. intel has been half right about things. So they've also been half wrong. So for instance, they've been saying for weeks, there's going to be an invasion. Now they knew military action was coming, but they guessed the wrong dates over and over again. And they were very specific and they guessed the wrong dates, but they were partially right. So let me tell you another narrative that the U.S. has been partially right about, and it relates to what you just were talking about. Great call, David. It's this idea of that Russia has a list of people they're going to take revenge on, and they've said they're LGBT people and minorities and stuff like. They're wrong on that, but they're right that Russia's got a list. And some of you Mother Hubbard Nazis out there. The people responsible for Odessa, right? If I want to quote a little otter from Animal House, people who did the Odessa massacre, dead. People responsible for the atrocities in Donbass, dead. People in Kiev who were actively supporting right sector, dead. That's what I'm saying. I'll bet they do have a list, and Putin's made it clear who the list is. And the list is of these Nazi Ukrainian supporters. And that's what I think they're going to do, David. It's not going to get rid of every Nazi. It's not going to end the ideology, but it will take out enough. And you watch. We'll see if I'm right or not. But that was a pretty accurate otter quote from Animal House. 202-521-1320. Rachel, what is on your mind?
Hey there. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'm just blown away about what is going on here with no discussion or debate with the public. I a top foreign policy analyst in Moscow just posted that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia says that more NATO arms are coming into Ukraine via Poland, and the belief is U.S. is helping with intelligence and nationalist extremist battalions. And he said this is and he said that it's transforming into a de facto Russia-NATO conflict. And then another article about the Biden administration trying to figure out if it's how they can get around legal, getting more weapons to Ukraine, and if that makes them a party to the conflict. They are about to put us into a nuclear war. I mean, Putin said if anybody interferes, you're going to have consequences like you've never seen before in history. And I don't. And by the way, I don't think that means nukes, but I think it does mean consequences. I think it means military action, because I think Putin knows the nukes. I think he's very reticent to do that. But I agree there are going to get consequences, Rachel. Yeah, I feel like, are our leaders this insane? Like, how are they able to insert themselves into this conflict is what I was asking. Okay, so that's a great setup for what I wanted to talk about a little bit here. And because I've already done the interview with Jared Koppas, we're going to play in the next half hour. I know what we talk about, and this will tie into that as well. And, Mark, you'll be able to stick around and listen to the Jareth interview, right?
Sure.
Yeah, because it'll be very interesting.
I like what the ladies were saying. They were on fire. I agree with everything they said.
Yeah, no, Rachel, great call. And so let me talk about Coca-Cola for a second. Pretend an alien, someone from another planet, extraterrestrial, not a Mexican. That's not what I'm talking about, Mark. Get your mind out of the racist anti-immigration swamp for a second. But imagine if someone from another planet came and they saw, they ran their tricorder or whatever on it, on Coca-Cola. They'd look at it, they'd go, what is this? This is nothing human beings should drink. This is sugar water, carbonated sugar water. And people pay for it, whereas out of those taps over there, they get free water, and water's good for people. You follow me? Yeah. And if an alien were looking at it, they'd go, this brown carbonated beverage makes no sense. And you said, no, my alien friend, let me explain it to you. There's a company in Atlanta, Georgia, the Coca-Cola company, and they've spent billions of dollars on marketing. And so when people are on their way to the restaurant, they may see a Coke logo 4 times, and it's so omnipresent, they're not even, it's on the menu at the bottom. It's on the billboard when you're driving there. It may be on a TV ad or radio ad where they say that we proudly serve Coke products. Why are you proud of that? I don't know. But do you see my point, Mark, is that propaganda works on people and they're not at all aware of it. And what we've learned is if you spend billions of dollars on marketing something, even if the product's not very good for you, people are going to, you can build a business that way. Does that make sense?
It does. In fact, the top marketing campaign in U.S. economic history was milk. Do you remember the milk mustache?
Yes.
It got people to drink milk because they had sexy, attractive, healthy-looking celebrities drink milk and leave a milk mustache, and that moved macro milk demand pretty heavily.
Yes, and milk, do you know who was not a big fan of milk? It was Arnold Schwarzenegger, his bodybuilder, actor, I'm putting that in air quotes, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if you listen to him in interviews, he'd say, milk is for babies. And he's not a big fan of milk, of the health benefits of milk. But you're right. So my point is that when you have a lot of money spent on marketing, it works. And people aren't even aware of it. So the biggest
subliminal too. Very subliminal.
It is subliminal because they don't say, you know, in big letters when you open the menu, when it says, we proudly serve Coke products, it doesn't say in a large 48-point font, this is a paid ad from Coca-Cola. Because if it said that, you'd go, well, they're not really that proud. They were paid by Coke to put it in the menu, which they were, by the way. So that's the reality of things. And Saul, who did you say we have on the line? Joe from Atlanta?
Joe from Atlanta.
Okay, I want to real quickly go to it. When we come, we'll take a short break. We'll come back, we'll play Jareth Koppes. But I'll talk a little bit more about this. But I'm going to just cap it with this. Ukraine is the biggest propaganda operation, someone argue with me, in world history. It's been going on for decades, supported by the State Department and the CIA. And all anyone has to do is go to your nearest search browser and type in "to catch a Nazi," L-E-B-E-D, Lebed, and you'll find the Village Voice story that talks about, and forget what you think of anything. That story details how the CIA was supporting a Nazi collaborator, Mykola Lebed, from Ukraine for decades. And furthermore, one of the big things in their propaganda operation, Mark, was hiding the existence of the propaganda operation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like one of the things the CIA didn't want people to know is that the CIA was involved with this guy. So they spent a lot of effort, time, and resources hiding their involvement, which means it is subliminal. And this, Ukraine.
I'm reading about this now. This is new to me.
Yes, and if you read that article, there's very little to argue with in it. It's a very detailed, well-researched article. And it lays out the decades-long propaganda campaign the U.S. State Department and CIA were involved in with this Nazi war criminal. And he's not the only one, and explains a lot of what's going on today. But it lays bare the propaganda effort. Real quickly, let's go to Joe in Atlanta. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind?
Hey, Lee. I wanted to point out that Ukraine's been a playground for carpetbaggers for a long time, and people need to ask themselves: is Ukraine better off under Russian control or under the control of carpetbaggers and the U.S.-backed Nazis? That's what people need to ask.
Well, no, and that relates to what I was just saying. And let me point out, let's go to a quick break here. When we come back, this interview with Jareth Koppes goes into some of this history. And the U.S. and these Banderites, one of the things that comes out in this interview with Jareth, one of the things that people forget about these Banderites is they're not just Nazis, they're sadistic Nazis. And when I say sadistic, when you look up what they would do, cutting open pregnant women and putting animals inside them and torturing people in the most horrible ways. Jareth and I talk about it a little bit. That's from Bandera himself, who was a sadist in that way. But this is part of what we're opposing. It's not just Nazis in a Mel Brooks Springtime for Hitler sense, people in the uniforms. We're talking, the cute Nazis, Mark. You know what I'm getting at. But these are sadists, and that's what's happened in eastern Ukraine. We got a great interview coming up right after this break. It's Frosty Friday. The great Mark Frost is joining us, making us all smarter here on The Backstory.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
Like beer? Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the report.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
And we are back, 105.5 FM, AM 1390. We're about to play an interview I did last night with Jareth Koppas. He's the author of a great book called Ukraine, Forever a Pawn. And Jareth really knows this stuff. And the thing that jumped out at me after doing the interview is I know it because I've been reading this, researching and stuff. But when I say these people are sadists, go look into what they did. These are sick, degenerate people. In the great film Reservoir Dogs, Mr. Blonde, look, everybody in that film are criminals. But they said, Mr. Blonde, that guy's nuts. And he was. And in the same way, there are Nazis, then there are Banderite Nazis. Let's hear that interview with Jareth Koppas. Enjoy. Fascinating. Here we go. Hit it all. And we are very happy to be joined by author Jareth Koppas, whose book, Ukraine, Forever a Pawn, is absolutely worth your time. A lot of people have asked me lately, Jareth, if they're trying to figure out this Ukraine thing because of the war and everything. And I will tell anybody, your book is a fantastic way to understand it. And I think the subtitle, Forever a Pawn, that's completely valid to discuss right now, don't you think, with the war going on?
Oh, most certainly. Once again, it's proven right throughout history that the land that is Ukraine is just being used by the great powers of the day.
Yes, and so let's talk about a little bit of stuff about Ukraine. So first off, Ukraine means the borderlands, correct? That's what it...
Yep.
And it's because geographically, it's sort of between the borderlands between Russia, Asia, and Europe. Is that right? What's the history there?
Yeah, so it originally was conquered by the people from the east, and it kind of, since it's such a fertile land and centered around a lot of waterways, it really became a huge growth spot for really humans in general. It's a cradle of civilization, really comes from this area. And as it sprung up, the people spread out further, the Goths settled it. I mean, this was every major empire you can think of has really been close to this land or relied on this land or been through this land at some point.
And so let's talk about a few things. Recently, Vladimir Putin, of course, made a speech, a historic speech, before he started the military attack, a day or two before. And he gave a history lesson. And one of the things he said that turned out to be, for some reason, I guess it's because Vladimir Putin said it, is controversial, is he basically pointed out that Ukraine did not exist as an independent country until 1917 or after. So from your extensive knowledge of this, was Putin right? Is he wrong?
Well, yeah, he's right. I didn't know that this was really a disputed point either. So I was really surprised when historians, when people were coming out and reacting as they were to this. It wasn't a solid foundation country until the Soviet Union, until Lenin essentially gave it that right as a country. So I didn't think this was a historical dispute. It really hasn't been between the diaspora that much or anything either. So it's kind of funny how that's become a sticking point from that entire speech he gave.
And one of the things that's interesting about that is what Putin's getting accused of a lot now is he wants to put the Soviet Union back together, right?
Yeah.
If he was trying to do that, Ukraine would be separate.
Right. It's always had its own sovereignty. It's a member state of the Soviet Union, but it's always been the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. It's had its own sovereignty then, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, after it became independent, it became independent before the fall of the Soviet Union. Since that day, it's just, again, been attacked by the West and come under the wing of the West.
Well, now, and the other thing he talked about is denazification of the current regime. And I've noticed this. I've talked about it with people, and some people get very upset when you talk about Ukraine's Nazis connections. But again, but if you notice that the Ukrainian diaspora is one of the people, I think, who gets very upset about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a very hard point for them to admit, apparently, but it's, again, another point that's you can't really dispute it. There's historical facts from every side on this, from the CIA, from the Soviet Union. There's historical facts from both sides of the conflict that show clearly Ukraine has had a connection, a very deep-rooted connection with both fascism and the Nazis themselves.
And it seems to me some of it is, and I've tried to explain this, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, and you can do a better job explaining it possibly, is that Stefan Bandera, the hero of the Ukrainian nationalist, Bandera's philosophy was about a concept that I think a lot of people don't understand, which is he wanted a pure Ukraine, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So originally, there were people before him, because the OUN, which he was part of, was kind of founded more around 1919. This was a group of Ukrainian nationalists that had come from the Polish War, and they had really sought to create this, like you're saying, this Ukrainian race is the mother race, is what they called. That's what Dmytro Donsov, he's one of their key ideological foundation members, stated that they are the race and that it's up to them to bring order to the world. And another quote that he gave, and this is the guy that was their main source of ideological guidance, Dmytro Donsov again, he stated, and this was back in 1923, that only when Russia falls will we be able to settle the Jewish question in our country. So they didn't need Hitler or the Nazis or anything. They already had this ingrained in their psyche. And that just bled through to Bandera, who then sought to align himself with Hitler.
Right. And that's what I've tried to explain to people. And is it fair if I say that sort of the way, because everyone's first off, people know a lot more about the Nazis than they do about the Ukrainians. They've all heard, everybody's heard of Hitler, and they know Germany and all that. And most people have heard of the Aryan race and that idea, you know what I'm saying, of Aryan supremacy. But Ukraine, it seems, had its own version of sort of like Slavic supremacy. Is that more or less fair to say?
Yeah, it's their brand of fascism, like how we have in the West. It's the Aryan, like you were saying there. It's just a slightly different flavor of insane.
Right, and it really is. It's a racial thing that they feel very strongly. The people who subscribe to this, and by the way, this is obviously not all Ukrainians, right?
No, not at all. It's actually a very small percentage if you look at the entire population that feel this way. But because of the coup that happened in 2014, they have been able to come to prominence with the help of the West. They've been given this power that they've traditionally been aligned with the West. So, of course, the West is going to continue to bolster them up, and now they really have a seat of power in the country, despite being a minority.
Now, and when we talk about this, what if someone says, look, there's Nazis, every country's got Nazis. There are Nazis in Russia as well, for instance. What would you say to that?
Well, of course there is, yes. But the main difference is, like I was just speaking about, these Nazis have a very large amount of power held in this country. They are fully ingrained in the military complex of Ukraine. And not only that, the main issue that you can see with the Ukrainian form of Nazism, it doesn't matter if you look at the Russian form of Nazism, if you look at every other type of Nazism, they don't hold the type of connections to the United States power structure as so many other forms of Nazi around the world. They've been in our country now since the end of World War II, since World War II, even before the end of it. They were already ingrained in our culture, and that's not just the U.S., that's Canada and the U.S., that they've been fully ingrained in, fully allowed into, and now hold firm seats of power in.
Now, we'll get back to this, but it occurs to me when I've thought about this that you mentioned since 2014. When I look back at the history of the CIA working with Mykola Lebed, for instance, it seems to me like the United States has been, pushing this ideology, promoting people who believe this ideology, and have increased that level of tension in Ukraine. Does that sound right?
Yeah. So when this started at the end of World War II, the CIA was an infant at the time, and the first group that the CIA really worked with were the Ukrainian nationalists. It's who they cut their teeth with their form of warfare that they spread around the world. So inherently, since they were working with them, they're going to take on that ideology somewhat as well, and they're going to allow those people into their structure as well. So they've assimilated with that ideology from the beginning. And honestly, if it weren't for the U.S., I sincerely doubt there would be even the small amount of extremists that exist today in Ukraine. I don't think it would be there at all.
And it seems like they are extremists. For instance, Bandera himself, he was part of a group that assassinated Polish officials, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he was a sadist. There were reports when he was in school that he would put wooden sticks underneath his fingernails, and that he had been caught burning himself with an oil lamp to prepare for being tortured by his enemies.
Yeah, maybe he was just into that, too.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know.
You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So not judging his kink, but just saying. So, and I think people need to understand this, because it's not just it's not just history. It's important, like you said, since 2014, they've been given power, not just groups like Right Sector, but the Azov Battalion, for instance, were literally put in charge of eastern Ukraine, correct?
Yeah, their stronghold is the city of Mariupol. The Azov Battalion is very strong in that part of the country, which is, I was speaking about this on Fault Lines, actually, just the other day before this had all happened. And I said that one of the first places that should be hit if there is conflict would be Mariupol, because it would take out the extremist sector quickly.
And sure enough, that's part of what happened once the attack started, correct?
Yeah. Yep, Mariupol is bombed heavily, and I hear there are hundreds of Azov dead, and, I'm not going to cry about that.
No, right. And I also heard, and this could just be war propaganda from the Russian side, that a lot of them fled.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised. I heard that as well. I heard a lot were giving up their weapons, a lot were running. But again, like you said, this is just the haze of war. There's so many different things coming out, and probably not even half of them are true. But
right. And so, so I found an article recently, and it summed up the way I feel about it, because sometimes when I brought up this Nazi thing with people, they get irritated. Like I'm bringing up some, like I found a picture of guys, with the Wolf's Angel armband or whatever.
Yeah, it's not hard to find that type of stuff.
And like I'm freaked out about that picture, and they don't understand. I found an article that said the Nazi thing is a cornerstone. It's not a detail, right? And do you think that's fair?
No, it's a major point. It's maybe one of the biggest reasons that there's a conflict there now. This is not something to be quibbled about or laughed at, or like it's just a propaganda point. This is a major reason for this conflict.
And it seems to me like, and I've made this analogy when I've tried to describe the Azov Battalion and it being integrated into the military, I said it would be like if the National Guard said, we're going to start the KKK regiment.
Yeah, that is a good comparison. I would say that's fair.
And then they said, let's put the KKK regiment on the National Guard in inner city Chicago. Keep the peace.
Right.
And if there was a lot of deaths of black people at the hands of this, you'd go, well, duh, you put the KKK, you put people who hate black people in charge. Is that what's going on? Do you see my weird analogy?
No, yeah, that's it. I mean, going along with that, when the Azov Battalion became a regiment in the Ukrainian army, they did perform such things like that. This is in the UN. This has been reported by Western agencies as well. When they were in the Ukrainian army, they were performing war crimes such as, one that always sticks out to me is they raped a mentally challenged elderly man and then buried him alive. So they were committing some crazy atrocities and would have continued to do that if the defenders of the republics had not stood up to them.
Well, no, and this is one of the things you talked about Bandera and the stuff he would do to himself. When I started reading about Bandera and some of the stuff,
it's sick
that he was doing. It really is sick. It really turns your stomach in World War II. Cutting people open and putting animals in them,
nailing babies to trees and wrapping them in barbed wire. I can't even begin discussing the levels of insanity that the people must have had to even think of those things. There were stories of Jews that would turn themselves into the Nazis because they feared being caught by the Ukrainian OUN members and what they would do to them. So the fact that a Jew would be afraid more of the Ukrainian factor than of the Nazis, I think says a lot.
No, right. And that's why with John Demjanjuk, who's the famous
Ivan the Terrible.
Ivan the Terrible, exactly right. When it was found out he was living in the United States back in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, either end of the 70s or early 80s. But when that came out, it came out that a lot of the most brutal concentration camp guards were Ukrainian. And I understand why, if you're Ukrainian, that's not thrilling.
Right. But you can also, if you're Ukrainian, you have the fact that far more Ukrainians joined the Soviet army and helped liberate the world from Nazism. That's what we can't forget either. But they need to recognize the blight on that country as well. And that's the only way to get past it, is to recognize it, to admit to it, and move on from it.
No, right. Yes. And as I say, it's almost so. Let's turn to Canada for a second, because in the recent trucker convoy, one of the prominent people working with Justin Trudeau is the Deputy Prime Minister, Christina Freeland.
Right.
And Christina Freeland is a proud Ukrainian Canadian. And we'll talk about that background in a second. But her grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was a Nazi. I don't. Some people say Nazi sympathizer. No, he was a Nazi, right? I mean.
Oh yeah, he was fully ingrained in it. He was a full-on Nazi. There's no doubt about it. He admitted to it in his memoirs. I mean, he was integral, if I remember correctly, in the creation of the SS Galician. And in his memoirs, he talks openly about how he wanted to join the Nazi army. So I don't think there's any historical view that you couldn't look at and see that he was a Nazi. So I don't know who's disputing that, but apparently they haven't really looked into it.
Well, one of the people who disputed it was Christina Freeland, who when it started to get reported, she said it's Russian disinformation, which is a tactic that's very common. It's a way to insult Russia.
Well, they've weaponized it. Weaponizing ignorance is the purest form of evil, and that's pretty much how you do it right there.
Yeah, and they've done a good job of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because Christina Freeland, there's a story in the most read newspaper in Canada is the Globe and Mail, and that's not a Sunday paper. And the Globe and Mail did a story about this a few years ago. That story is still up there. It's not corrected. It does have a little thing at the top that says, this story's over 4 years old, and some information may have been updated. But it doesn't say, oh, Christina Freeland's lying here, by the way. Because now, and in her case, it's not just that her grandfather, her maternal father, was a Nazi, and that she lied about it. But she's said in interviews, how much have you looked into Christina Freeland, Jareth?
You know, the Canadian diaspora hasn't been my focus. I have looked into a gentleman named Taras Hunsak, and he has a connection with both Lebed and Christina Freeland and her family as well. But you may know more about that than me.
Well, I'll tell you this, too. It is hard to find. Here's one of the other things. Researching this stuff, and I don't want to whine because, you know, they pay me because it's not easy. But you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But it is really hard to get to the truth sometimes because you've got to cut through so much BS. Does that make sense?
Right. There's BS from both sides, too. That's what makes it even more difficult.
Well, because this is and that's worth pointing out, is that some of the stuff on some of these stories, there was Soviet propaganda about people like Bandera.
Right.
Well, thanks, Soviets. That didn't help at all. Right?
Right. That's really the crux with a lot of this is sifting through what is true and what's untrue, what's reasonable and what's not.
Yes. And it's brutal. So, you know, when you're researching this stuff, it can be difficult. But let me take you to current events. Jareth, what's your take, just anything you want to say on what's going on right now with Vladimir Putin launching this Russian attack on Ukraine? What's your take on it? What occurs to you?
Sure. First, I don't think it's an attack. I think it's a movement. Like he said, it's a military operation to demilitarize and denazify a dangerous group of people on Russia's doorstep, and they have every right. With the UN Charter, with every single thing, when you've got Zelensky saying he wants to get nukes, when you've got genocide actually occurring, yes, it is. I believe it is genocide when they're attacking because of their ideology. They are attacking a specific type of person and trying to kill them because of their differences in ideology. I believe that is the pure form of genocide. So, and they've been killing tens of thousands of innocent people. So I think Russia had every right to step in. I believe this was going to happen. I've been saying it's going to happen. People in my circles have been saying this was going to happen. The recognition didn't make me feel like this was the end of the war. That made me realize that Putin and I hate that I even do it as well, that I say Putin did this when it's not just Putin. Putin isn't a dictator. There is the State Duma, the upper and lower houses. He has people to answer to as well, and he has people around him, obviously. He's not sitting in his room planning this entire attack. This was something that was prepared in advance, well prepared in advance, and it should have been done a long time ago. I'm happy to see it happening. War is never good, but when the war has been going on for 8 years, which is what people fail to see, that this isn't the start of a war. This has been going on for 8 years. It's been a crawling conflict with civilians bearing the brunt of the evilness and of the deaths. So now it's just going to be brought to a head. And larger scale. I mean, people I'm close to, Russell Bentley has said, as goes Donbass, goes the world. And I think there's not a truer statement, if you ask me, currently in our world.
And, first off, I agree with everything you're saying, and I feel strongly about it too. And I also feel like very strongly, because I know the facts and the history here, that we're on the right side. Right.
It's been interesting the past couple of days that I feel not vindicated, because I mean, all I've done is I just talk about this. I'm not affected. My life isn't in danger, but this feels like the closest thing that there has been to a victory for the people of Donbass and for the people who have really been suffering. This feels like the closest thing to a victory that they've had, at least in my opinion. I feel lighter. I feel a different sense in the air almost than I felt in the past 8 years. And like I said, I'm just a person who talks about it.
Well, no, you do more than that, because your book, Ukraine Forever Upon, it really is a fantastic book, and I highly recommend people get it and read it. But if I could wave a magic wand and not have a war to get the same result, I'm in favor of the magic wand, but I've not found those. Right. So if someone's got a better alternative,
let's hear it.
Right, and I've not heard it.
And they tried that. They tried the Minsk agreements. Russia tried for 8 years. The republics tried to have them follow the Minsk Accords. And every step of the way since 2014, they have failed to do so.
Yeah, well, hey, Jarrett, let me end it here. Fantastic appearance. Again, your book, Ukraine Forever Upon, where can they get that? Where's the best place people can get that book?
Go to rodionpress.com, RODION press.com.
Jarrett Koppas, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Lee. It's always a pleasure.
And there we go, the great Jarrett Koppas. We're almost out of time. Mark, any comments on that interview with Jarrett Koppas?
What I picked up on a lot was when he said, especially when all sides are doing it with regards to misinformation. It's what I meant when I started talking about my little experiment flipping back and forth between the major channels. They were all so biased.
Well, and also let me point out there that that's one of the ideas of full spectrum dominance. And I talk about that all the time. And I think some of the people easiest to fool right now are the people who are Republican, were Trump supporters, saw through Russiagate, so they feel a little smug. Does that make sense, Mark? That they think like, oh, yeah. I get propaganda. I wouldn't fall for tricks. But they're the kind of people who are going to fall for the tricks. There we go. Fantastic show. Mark, any closing comments in the last 30 seconds we have here?
Drums are good. Buy a set.
There we go. Mark, I can't disagree with that one. Possibly. Fantastic show. Thanks so much to Wyatt Reed for joining us. And thanks again to Jarrett Koppas for being part of the show and pre-taping the interview. He's got a schedule. It's a little tricky. But check out his book. I'll be obsessing about this on Twitter @Stranahan. I'm working on a course about Ukraine that you might be interested in. I'll talk about that if I get it done this weekend. Screw up my obsession. Until next time, this is The Backstory. I'm Lee Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Good evening. Welcome to the Critical Hour. We're coming to you from the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, political analyst, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
For the next 2 hours, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. Al Jazeera reports Moscow floats prospect of talks, Putin open to sending delegation to Minsk, Kremlin says, as Russian troops target Ukraine's capital. Russia claims Kyiv has gone silent.